Hi, everyone. From time to time, we're going to talk a little bit about areas of the class that should be emphasized more, maybe to discuss areas that the book does not go into a lot of detail about. And this is going to be one of those opportunities. What I like to do as a supplement to both our textbook and our primary source readings is occasionally post some lectures that give you a little bit of background information on what we're looking at currently as far as the timeline of the class. Now, obviously, our main textbook, um, Professor Davis's book, goes into some detail about the background of slavery in the ancient world and even biblical history and justifications of the institution of slavery. But today I want to talk a little bit about Africa, a major part of the world where the Europeans will have contact with and will be critical as to the slave trade and its proliferation from the 1400s up until the 1800s. So, with that in mind, I want to give a little bit of background about Africa, the continent itself, and to remind all of us that it is a very different continent depending on what part of the geography that we're talking about. The ecology is very different. Most of Africa is in the tropics. I'm going to put up and change slides for this PowerPoint. The northern and southern areas have more moderate climates, a more Mediterranean climate, and we can see that here. Let's use this slide, and we'll kind of illustrate a little bit of background that you probably know. And near, of course, the southern areas of Europe, you have a more Mediterranean climate. You can see that it is dry, but with the Atlas Mountains there, it's not dry as the desert areas. Obviously, moving to the south, you have multiple sections of what you would call, and it's underneath the Atlas Mountains and the desert. It's called Sahel, Sahel. That's a semi-dry region. Sometimes it transitions in the case of the Atlas Mountains to the north, which nearly connects with Spain there. You can see at the very top of the map. You can see the Sahel also then begins to transition to the Sahara Desert, even though there are mountainous ranges and plateaus within the Sahara Desert itself. Then you have this section below the Sahara, another Sahel that is not as dry until you move into what we might consider more of a rainforest region of the continent. Starting there, if you were to draw out east from the Cape Verde Islands, all the way through equatorial Africa, moving south until we get to other areas of Sahel and finally the Kalahari Desert to the south. So, like Europe and Asia and the Americas, climate makes a difference when we're talking about the uh, development of Africa, the development of some of the strong political traditions and where political power was centered in what regions of the continent of Africa. Africa is 3 times the size of the United States, just to give you a scale in what we're talking about. And much like talking about Europe or Asia or the Americas, to talk about the typical African is very misleading. It's like saying the Native American when you're applying a term to an Indian who lives in places of Canada, in Mexico, or in what's now Florida. Very, very different. So that term is misleading. Obviously, there are different factors of race when we're talking about sub Sahara Africa as opposed to the north, the integration with other parts of the world. Obviously, Central Africa is more isolated from Europe than Northern Africa, what we would almost call Mediterranean Africa. Right there, the region that's nearly touching parts of Italy and Greece, the Middle East, and of course, Spain and Portugal, 2 of the nations that are going to be critical in developing and opening up the continent of Africa more to the understanding of Europeans. So, geography and weather is always connected and is very part of this story. Below the Sahara, you have a much more moderate climate, but to the north, in what we would call and still call today Tunisia, it was very much integrated in part of the Mediterranean world. The Greeks called the area of, again, to illustrate to you that this is not a completely isolated continent. Yes, parts of it are, and Europeans won't really penetrate the continent of Africa for colonization, the middle areas in the south of Africa, until the 1800s. And that's because in this particular case, the story of Africa, we know, is of Europeans' exploitation in the form of slavery. But Europeans were not able to move into and colonize the areas below the equator and the interior of the continent until they were able to find ways to fight off African diseases, which passed from that continent to Europeans. Malaria and tropical diseases. It took the development of drugs like quinine to be able to make that possible, but much later. So when we talk about Africa, we know that part of the area is not well known. There's a lot of mystery behind it, but other areas are very integrated into what we would call the Mediterranean world, and that would make it writ large the European world. To the Middle East, you can see there modern areas of Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Persia went by different names, part of the Ottoman Empire during the centuries from 800 onwards. So this is what we need to understand a little bit more, especially as we talk about the development of New World slavery in the 1400s and beyond. The Greeks called the area Libya, and the Romans would later call the region Africa. They would christen the continent. West Africa is made up of an area of the Sahara. A little further south, you have rainforests integrated with mountain ranges. 1,200 languages may have existed in this part of the continent. But it's important to understand that because the Europeans would begin to interact with areas of Western Africa, and as they moved and explored along the sets of islands that are off the coast of Africa, farther south towards the equator. Again, not moving for direct control into the continent until much later, but establishing connections by which tens of thousands and then millions of slaves were taken from the continent, brought back initially to Europe and to areas of the Middle East, and also to the Americas. We see the advent of the slave trade. So it's worth talking about that areas, and we'll use another slide here. I wanted to bring up this particular slide because it shows us, and it actually has, some of the areas where Europeans first start making contact with the islands off the coast of Africa. And this is one of those examples of going into some detail where often the textbooks do not, whether it be a class on just American history or this particular one on comparative slavery. Off the coast of Africa, we have a set of islands. You can see them marked here on the slide. There's 3 sets of islands, but the Canary Islands, all in the first half of the 15th century, meaning the 1400s. The Portuguese and the Spanish begin to have contact. There are 11 Canary Islands. They're tiny off the coast here of Africa. But if you're sailing in small ships, and if you're moving incrementally southwest from Lisbon, Portugal, or areas of Spain, and you're moving along the coast, again, you know that the continent is there. You know about North Africa. You know about the trade routes that had existed for hundreds of years. But now you're beginning to explore, and for reasons that we're going to discuss, and for reasons that you're probably familiar with. There are trade routes that Europeans can access all the way across what we now recognize as the Middle East to try to seek and obtain the wealth of India and China, what they would call the East Indies, Southeast Asia. Indonesia would be another term, more modern term. But these are items like silks and spices and cotton. There was sugar cane. And those items were known about going back to the 1100s. I mean, obviously, the Crusaders were fighting in areas of the Middle East for control of Jerusalem going back several hundred years. Marco Polo, the Italian, had traveled to areas of China. Christopher Columbus kept a very well-worn edition of Marco Polo's journals. And the question for the Western Europeans. And those leaders in exploration were the Spanish and the Portuguese, were how to maybe bypass those land routes because they weren't always easy to access. They took a long time. They were controlled by, as far as the Spanish and the Portuguese were concerned, one of their traditional enemies. And those were the powers of the Middle East, the Islamic powers of the Middle East, an expansionist group, an expansionist religion going back to 800. So this map shows us how do you get from Western Europe to, and you can see listed at the right side of the map all of the things that they knew about and wanted to obtain. How can you possibly short that route? Oh, or also how can you shorten the route into the interior of Africa? Because there were slaves already coming out of central parts of Africa and a slave trade that existed in the numbers of the hundreds, not the millions yet. There was gold, there was copper, there was ivory. And so going back to the whole Canary Islands, it's the first, I would say, contact that Europeans have with a group that was fairly isolated. The Canary Islanders were olive-skinned, and they had probably been from areas of North Africa where the Moors or the Berber people had lived for a long time, crafted some kind of sailing vessels, made their way to these islands, and had become essentially isolated for a long time. The Cape Verde Islands, if you were to head further south from the Canary Islands, again, the map marks the different areas by which some of the islands were not occupied, but you can see there, within the first several decades of the 15th century or the 1400s, both Spain and Portugal have made their way into these islands. The Canary Islands and the islanders specifically, there may have been about 50,000 who lived on those 11 islands in huts and caves. They found both the Portuguese and the Spanish that they could plant sugarcane very successfully there. They knew sugarcane existed. They knew it could be grown in areas of the Eastern Mediterranean where the climate was favorable to that. They also were able to grow it off the coast of these islands. And they were also able to explore. This is the story that's critically important, as the Canary Islanders were, again, different. Europeans thought we can subjugate them. They often fought us. If they fought us, we can justify enslaving them. But when they died, we also had to find another labor force. And that's when, in some ways, I think we could say safely that the blueprint for New World slavery happens on these tiny islands off the coast of Africa and Europe, especially on the Canary Islands. And that goes back to the idea of why the Europeans would sail. This is another, I love this map because it literally shows us the world known to Europe in 1492. All right, so it's a little ahead of where we're talking about in the story. We want to kind of set this around 1400 when we're going to talk about the development of politically some of the areas along the Sudan, below the Sahara Desert in Africa, from the west all the way over to where it connects to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. So the Spanish and Portuguese for 100 years, I mean, they incrementally, this is before Columbus, so this is starting around 1400. Geographically, the Spanish and the Portuguese are uniquely suited, right, to sail to the south and to the west. They know Africa is there. They've known going back to ancient Greece and Rome, it was part of the Mediterranean world. They also knew about the items that were coming from Central Africa, the area that was such a mystery to them. They knew there were abundant trade routes, and there were camels and other pack animals taking those items from areas of closer to equatorial Africa up through the north, up through the Sahara, and they were making their way into what's marked on the map as Persia and Arabia. Again, nominally under the control of the Ottoman Empire there in what is now modern Turkey. So the Europeans, and especially, we're talking about Spain and Portugal, because the other parts of Europe were not strong enough really to even consider going out or having the curiosity to begin to explore. Some of the states in Central Europe, the Italian states, plural, because Italy is not unified until much later, began to make trade agreements with some of these North African countries. And it was the way they could survive, even though what do we think of Italy? I mean, it seems to be the heart of Christianity, the Vatican, and the Roman Catholic Church. Nevertheless, they could see what was happening. Islam was expanding greatly across the Middle East to the west over areas of North Africa. So much so that Spain and Portugal were aware of this. I mean, in 800, the Moors invaded Spain and had been occupying that part of southwestern Europe for hundreds of years. And it took almost until 1500 before the Spanish were finally able to unite enough different sections of Spain so that they could repel the Moors. And that happened in 1492. Yes, coincidentally, the same year that the Spanish crown gave permission for this upstart Italian from Genoa, Christopher Columbus, to take a few ships and sailors and go out to the west. That's why Columbus's journey was so radical at the time. By the time that Columbus sailed, you can see on this map, the Portuguese knew about the size and scope of Africa, and they also would, not long after Columbus sailed, find a way to get into the Indian Ocean by going around the southern coast of Africa. And that took a long time. We're talking about months, as opposed to, hell, maybe years to take the same routes across by land. So Columbus had this radical idea, as we probably know the story, just to sail west, not knowing, because the map here shows that they didn't know that the Americas were there. So Columbus says, I'm going to sail west, and in a few weeks, I'll end up in what's now China and Japan. And he didn't exactly get that right, as we know. Now, Africa itself, like Europe and like the Mesoamerica, we might say from Mexico south to Central and South America, was undergoing a significant amount of change. We can see that mapped here. Different West African empires from 1000 to 1500. So this encapsulates the expansion of Islam into North Africa from the Middle East, starting in 800, where the Ghana Empire was strong, replaced by the Empire of Mali around 1400. So this is the transitional period from 1400 to 1500. This is when the Songhay Empire, with its center of power, you can see it right there in the middle of the slide, hopefully, at Gao, right here, G-A-O, near the center of learning in Western Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. It was known as Timbuktu. We know that it was probably upwards of 80,000 university centers of learning. I mean, when Europe was going through what we call, and this is not an exactly accurate term, the Dark Ages, after the fall of Rome, we have, of course, this stereotypical image. It's Europe before the Renaissance and before the Reformation and obviously the Enlightenment. But the centers of learning in the world, we don't often put in Europe, but it did happen to be in the Middle East and Africa. And so we should center that story in Timbuktu. So here is a map charting the great African empires. And I think what we have to understand is that there were reforms put in, the rise of the Songhay Empire around 1500 under Sani Ali, who integrated his holdings with a large navy and was able to achieve some dominance in parts of West Africa, but just West Africa, not North Africa. Certainly, there are areas that were not settled by many people at all, the desert. And when we talk about the consolidation of power, someone like Sani Ali or Askia Muhammad, they would want to strengthen their power if they could, the same way that the monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, married themselves. There were rival sections of Spain, just as we would say the King Louis of France, or when we go to the Americas, talking about the Mexica people, the Aztec Empire under Montezuma would want to consolidate their power. Or, we'll fast forward a little bit, the leader of the Algonquins in Virginia, Powhatan, who controlled areas of maybe 30,000 Indians in what's now Eastern Virginia, where the English would settle after 1600. So Songhay became one of the most powerful states in West African history around the same time that the continent was being discovered in more detail by the Europeans. We have social and political reforms. Some of the leaders, Askia Muhammad actually traveled to Mecca in the late 1400s. So there was, at least in this section, and we'll go back to the map, this would be the Western Sudan. Once upon a time, the Sudan as a nation now, we know it's again south of Egypt, but back then the Sudan kind of ran all the way across from Eastern Africa, all the way across from the Indian Ocean to West Africa. The Sudan literally was a reference to that part of the continent below the Sahara Desert. Okay. So political power is centered in the Western Sudan with the Songhay Empire around 1500. But we can say as a continent, there is no leader of Africa the same way there is no leader of the Americas, North America, whether it be Canada, what's now the United States, South America, at the time of European exploration and the start of colonization in the 15 and later the 1600s. I think that may have hurt the development of Africa. And it was a way for the Europeans to take advantage and move into that situation and to begin to make connections with African traders, which of course resulted in the great expansion of slavery. So, summarizing quickly, Africa is not isolated. Parts of it are, yes, but North Africa is connected to the Mediterranean world. They know that below the Sahara Desert, items from the Sudan are being brought up. People, slaves, to a small scale. Ivory, gold, are making their way. I think I have a map of the trade routes. Let's see, there they are. Trading centers, you can see them marked throughout the Western Sudan and areas all the way up to what's now Morocco, Tunisia. And you can see how it would make the Europeans aware of what was at the interior of Africa, although a lot of people didn't really know. They knew the existence of Timbuktu in areas controlled by Songhay Empire. But they also, when Europeans would draw the map, when they would draw the map below the Sahara Desert, they would kind of be imaginative about it. They didn't know the formal boundaries and the size and scope of the continent of Africa. They often drew the central part of the continent with monsters or creatures, the same way that American map makers would, kind of have mastodons and woolly mammoths, and they just put a big, large alligator somewhere near Louisiana and Florida because they didn't know exactly what was there because they hadn't explored it in a lot of detail. So there isn't a lot of knowledge of the interior. There were rumors that there was a wealthy king in Central Africa. That didn't really exist, but this is wrapped in mystery. So only North Africans knew of the interior. And I'm sure those North Africans were the traditional enemy in many cases of, especially the Portuguese and the Spanish, would want to keep those secrets very close to them if they could. Now, other areas of Africa further south. Now, obviously, the Niger River was critical. It's right here in the part of what becomes, we know later on, as Senegambia, Western Africa, near the Cape Verde Islands. When we move farther south, and this is a reminder of the fact that during the decades of the 1430s, 40s, and 50s, the Spanish and Portuguese begin to move further along the coast towards equatorial Africa. That's when they come in contact with other areas, the Congo Empire, the region around the equator and south. Maybe 500,000 people at the time lived there. Subparts of the Congo Empire, the Ndongo and Angola, are all part of the slave trade. They have agriculture and livestock there. But also one of the challenges to Africa during this time is the fact that there are few indigenous crops in the area. Geography makes a difference. Obviously, the development is based on whether you can feed people. Bananas and plantains, for example, were brought over from India. Later on, from Europe, wheat and barley, pigs, horses brought from Europe, and that transformed agriculturally areas along the equator and further areas to the south. And this had started to take place maybe as early as the year 1000. But what inhibits the development, large scale of animal husbandry in these areas of the continent is the tsetse fly, which was particularly damaging to larger pack animals. And again, that would inhibit the ability to have these beasts of burden develop larger scale agriculture. Nevertheless, Europeans by the middle and later part of the 1400s began to push further and further along the coast of southern and western Africa. So geography can inhibit growth. What we do know about the continent of Africa is that slavery did exist prior to Europeans very rapidly expanding it during the especially 15, 16, and 1700s. There was wide experience in slavery within African societies. One of the critical differences, of course, between slavery in Africa and the future New World slavery, as we'll call it, during the height of the slave trade, is that it probably wasn't a permanent status in African cultures. Some were. Certainly that is the case. And some may have been treated like serfs, agricultural workers, or military, doing a number of different, again, tasks associated with manual labor. But more often than not, we call African slavery a temporary condition. It may have been passed down by the law. It may have been a punishment. Again, unable to put people in large penitentiaries because they didn't exist. You would have to serve as a slave for a short period of time, either to a person as some type of bodyguard, house servant, do any kind of number of jobs, tasks, translator. But we also know that slaves in Africa traditionally could marry. They did have some control of their income. They also could buy their freedom. So when we compare it to modern, again, we would say American slavery, as the French and the Spanish and English had slaves in the New World when they started their colonies. This is not something we often, well, early on in some of these slave societies, there was more fluidity and ability to get your own freedom, to have some civil rights and civil liberties. But that system changed, obviously, by the 17 and 1800s. No southern state would later acknowledge marriage among slaves. It was very difficult to buy your freedom, and if you did, or you were freed by your owner, owner would have to then move you out of the colony or later the state. So this wasn't the case. It wasn't an overwhelming system of control that we commonly associate with it in Africa. Slaves could have a number of tasks in Africa. They could be, again, translators. They could be military aides. They could work in as different domestic slaves, whether they be women or children. They could be bureaucrats in the government, and they could also do manual labor. They could use slaves to move gold, ivory, copper, the things that they took from sub-Saharan Africa and the Sudan. You would need that forced labor to move these items north along the trade routes through the Sahara Desert and connect it to, again, Mediterranean Africa as they moved out through Tunisia and other parts into Europe. Slaves were, for the most part, designated as slaves through military conquest, but sometimes they were political dissenters. But more often than not, we found studying that slaves were captured in battle, and oftentimes the condition was not permanent. We so associate slavery with, oh, you have it for life, it's passed down from one generation to another. That certainly wasn't the case. as it existed on the smaller scale in Africa before the Europeans began to exploit and really accelerate the process of capturing slaves. So, what changes do happen in the slave trade? We're talking about another slide here we'll look at. The roots of the slave trade, you can see as they already existed, areas going from the Sudan to the north and the south. So cut across there, just above equatorial Africa. And you can see that it moves in the directions distinctly to the north through the Sahara Desert and southwest to the areas along the Gold Coast and later further south below the equator in places like Angola, and which is sections of the Congo there. And look where those slaves begin to leave. Some go back to Europe, but an overwhelming amount go to South America, to the Caribbean, and to the Americas. So this region here, this map will show you the movement of the slave trade, and two factors accelerate during the aftermath of Europeans having contact and beginning to make those, we might say, connections with West Africa. If you look from the Canary Islands on this map all the way south, that orange outline shows you the origin of the slave cargoes. You can see that the European control of West Africa is not total and not complete. Slaves who were moving out of that part were captured within Africa by other Africans, moved along to the coast. Europeans who wanted to go and cut out African middlemen, it didn't work that way. It didn't work. They weren't militarily strong enough. They did not have resistance to African diseases. And that prevented Africa, and specifically Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, from being essentially annihilated like Native Americans. Again, we often say, why didn't that happen? Africa as a continent proved to be fairly resilient, and those were the reasons behind it. And a lot to do. I mean, we're talking about a slave trade during the entire course of the slave trade of 10 to 12 million people. So the destination for slaves, this is the other part of the story we're not exactly maybe as familiar with as we should be. They were continuing to be funneled through North Africa into parts of Southern Europe and into the Middle East and to areas you can see also of what's now India. We often think and associate the slave trade with going all the way and only solely to the West. That isn't really the case. Women and children in African societies did a lot of the agricultural work, and that's why it was preferred, for the most part, to try to capture women and children initially in the slave trade. Women and children, especially children, could be easily adapted into either societies in the Middle East, into Southern Europe, or into the Americas. And of course, children were young, healthier, and they could, of course, when they were moved to the New World, hopefully be fit and healthy enough to have children. And those children, when the law allowed for it, would pass along to also a condition of slavery. One of the reasons why I wanted to pick the Equiano book, and this is where we can kind of link it to a future lecture where we're going to talk about the Middle Passage, is that he talks about the process of being captured. He talks about the process of coming to the coast and seeing the European ships. He talks about the process of getting on the ship in the Middle Passage, the voyage from Western Europe to the first New World destinations. So Europeans are aware of the trade of slaves into the interior. They're also aware of the very lucrative trade routes to Asia. So what I think they were doing, one of their reasons to try to explore and take their sailing ships south and to the west, is to figure out, how do we bypass the fact that we don't control Mediterranean Africa and the traffic of slaves? So can we go directly to West Africa and not have to purchase slaves through those in the Middle East, those traders and middlemen? Can we do it on our own? And they ended up being very successful at that. So the Portuguese begin to open the continent fairly slowly, starting in the 14 teens, but by the 1490s, and this map shows it. That's why you can see around Cape Town and southern areas of Africa, the Portuguese were the first to shoot into the Indian Ocean and to find areas of Southeast Asia. Portugal and Spain, they want gold, silver, ivory. These are the primary goals that send them. Later on, they will become traders of slaves, as will other European nations. Obviously, the Dutch, the English, and the French, all taking advantage where a good portion of them, the number of slaves from West Africa, are captured, brought to West African, basically, prisons, these highly protected forts, to where slaves are brought from the interior on the first part of the passage. They're awaiting the middle passage. They're basically locked in fort prison kind of combinations, to which the Europeans built because the slave trade was very, very lucrative and very profitable. And then slaves on the middle passage would go to their first New World destination. So this is what brings it all on. This is why I wanted to kind of give this as background to why it's important for us to recognize the beginnings of this worldwide slavery process. Now, part of what we talk about in this class is going to be a combination of the textbook and what you read in the primary sources, but also this is a comparative slavery class. So we'll be reading about it as it pertains not just to the Americas, but to different parts within the Americas and then what later becomes the United States, but to Central America, and by that I mean the Caribbean and South America as well. These become two of the main areas. For as much as we associate American history with slavery, and we rightfully should, only a small number of slaves from Africa go directly to what we now recognize as the United States. An overwhelming amount, I should say, are going to South America, to Brazil specifically, to work in sugar and silver mines, and to the Caribbean as well. Well, we'll know why that's the story as we get a little bit farther, but it has to do, in fact, with the slave regimes and what they are demanding of Africans to do, plantation agriculture. So David Bryan Davis talks about this in our textbook, and I'll just mention it quickly that New World slavery changes because of the volume of slaves. It did exist in Africa. There were trade routes from the Sudan, Africa, to the north, through the Sahara, into areas of Europe and to the Middle East. Europeans came along. They made these connections. They brought European trade goods to West Africa, along with guns and other things. Took slaves out by the thousands and then by the millions. So the number in the New World slave trade increased. Secondly, slaves more and more were devoted to a single task. We mentioned what slaves would do in Africa. It was not permanent. It was not handed down from one generation to another. And there were a number of tasks that slaves did in Africa. So New World slavery increased the volume. And secondly, what it also did was it usually had slaves work at one particular area of processing cash crops, whether that be coffee, sugarcane, cotton, tobacco, hemp, rice. So those were two of the more critical changes that made New World slavery different from Old World slavery. But this sets, I think, a brief but fair background on this part of the continent that we have to bring into the story. So I hope this makes the beginnings of what we see as New World slavery, the focus of this class, a little more clear to all of you.